Welcome to the Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind podcast with Corey Shapiro. Today we have a conversation with questionologist Warren Berger, who's on the show to help us ask better questions about divorce. You may be thinking, like I am, what's a questionologist? Is that even real? Well, it's a person who studies the art and science of questioning. And he's been doing this for 3 decades. And before that, he was a journalist. His work appeared in one of my favorite newspapers, New York Times, one of my favorite magazines, Wired. And if I didn't like him already, he even co-wrote a book by one of the best hosts from one of those reality TV shows that's been on forever, Phil Kogan from Amazing Race. He co-wrote No Opportunity Wasted. And he's here to help us. So welcome him to the show. And remember, these questions are going to help us be creative, not trying to be reactive. So you can find more about Warren's work if you want to learn a little bit about it at warrenberger.com. You can go to his blog, which has a lot of information, at amorebeautifulquestion.com. His latest book, he focused on helping people in the educational sphere. And that's so smart, going right at the beginning, at the root. It's called Beautiful Questions in the Classroom with co-author Elise Foster. Okay, to get us started, Warren, I want you to go back to your early days, maybe 3 decades ago. What led you on this path becoming a questionologist?
Okay, so 3 decades ago, I was a journalist, a working journalist. I was a reporter and also a feature writer. So when you're a reporter, you work really hard on your questions. It's really the tool of the trade for a journalist. It's something you use every day. It's like, a question for a journalist is like a hammer for a carpenter, right? It's one of the most basic tools in your toolbox. I tended to think about my questions a lot in advance. When I was going to meet someone or interview someone, I would work really hard on questions, and I was sort of teaching myself at that point. The interesting thing, Corey, is that, I went to journalism school, and I went to a good journalism school at Syracuse University. They never really taught much about questioning. Isn't that weird? In journalism school, they don't focus that much on questioning.
I felt the same way in law school. I felt like I didn't learn much in law school either. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. They will teach you about the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, but they don't really teach you like how to construct a question well, or what you should be trying to do when you're asking a question. So a lot of it for me was self-taught. I would go into an interview and so I'd try to figure out what is it that is going to elicit, interesting information from this person. Sometimes I'd be interviewing a politician. Sometimes I'd be interviewing a business leader. It could be a celebrity. I interviewed a bunch of celebrities. But so I'd always be trying to figure out, these people get interviewed a lot. They get talked to a lot. What can I ask them that will, I don't want to put them off. I don't want to ask them a question that's going to stump them. But I also want to ask a question that will kind of open them up and get them to maybe get off automatic pilot. A lot of times when you interview people, they're on autopilot, So you wanted to figure out, how do I get them to engage? That may be the most important thing you're trying to do with questioning, is you're trying to get people to engage with you and you're trying to engage with them. So I kind of was self-taught, and I studied ways of asking questions. And then somewhere along the line, an interesting thing happened. I changed my whole view of questioning, because I was interviewing a lot of business leaders and innovators. As you mentioned, I wrote for Wired magazine, places like that. So a lot of times I'd be interviewing some guy who was this cool guy in the tech world. He'd come up with this amazing startup or this amazing tech creation, And so I was interviewing a lot of those kind of people, right? And what I've noticed is that those people are great questioners. like inventors, creators, leaders. They're really great questioners, but they're using questioning in a different way than I was. Like I was using it as an interpersonal tool, from me to get information from another person, whereas they were using it almost on themselves. They would ask themselves really great questions about their industry or about a problem that was out there in the world, and they'd take hold of those questions and work on them. Why hasn't someone come up with a better way to do X? And what if I combine this with that? What would happen? Could I then address this problem of X? And what would be the next step after that? So they would be like formulating and working on these kinds of really big, challenging questions, either by themselves or with a small group of like their teammates, or their colleagues. So I found that fascinating because, like I said, it kind of shifted my whole view of questioning to, okay, there's another aspect of this. It is an amazing communication tool, but it's also something else. It's like this tool that you use for yourself when you want to solve problems, when you want to like change your thinking, or when you want to like move in a different direction. Oftentimes it starts with asking the right question. That became kind of a driving theme for me. It's kind of once I thought of questioning that way, now it's not just about me and how can I be a better questioner. Now it becomes like, okay, this applies to everybody. So how can everybody use this tool, and what should they know about it, and how it works, and that kind of thing. So that was it. And that kind of put me on this path of being a questionologist, if you will, a term I kind of coined myself, and started writing books about it, started giving talks about it, started going to schools, companies, NASA space program, U.S. Army. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and it's become my thing now. It's become like my calling.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's great. I think that change when I was reading your works, it was just seemed very natural. As a professional, I'm supposed to give advice. That's the tendency. But I found that when people are so charged, it's really hard.
Yeah,
it's really hard to take advice, and it really comes down to first getting from their perspective. And I think these questionings is a great step in the right direction. So let's apply, since this is a podcast about divorce, let's apply some of this wonderful questioning, that skills that you have,
right,
to some real life situations. And I know we're talking about divorce, but one thing that comes up so much, and now we're doing this in the summer, and last podcast I did something about a prenup, is discussing a prenuptial agreement. And I think that's an interesting thing because in one sense, a marriage is supposed to be romantic, supposed to be maybe lifelong. You have your family, it's secure. The engagement is so exciting. You get maybe give or get a diamond. You have all these announcements. You have this beautiful wedding. And then the next day, are you like, hey, let's sign a prenup? I don't see many people putting on Instagram photos of their prenups. Okay, no one really does that. It's not. So there is a stigma, even though I think as a divorce attorney, it's smart. Think of Tom Brady, who had their divorce, which is Bunchen. They had a civilized divorce. So people are doing it. But I do think a lot of people find it uneasy. So if you're in one of those situations, what are some questions you think you could ask to change the mindset from being something unromantic to being something as smart as getting life insurance?
I don't know that there are specific questions, or if there are, I don't know that I'm the one to give those to you, because the specific questions are going to probably come from someone who's a professional in the field, right? Who's studied this. What I can give you is more general guidelines for questioning and how questioning could be used in a situation like this. So one of the things I find with questioning is, so it's a really valuable tool, but you have to use it the right way. And in the case of particularly when you're having difficult conversations, it's really easy for the questioning to become aggressive or confrontational. So the first thing you need to know going into any challenging conversation is that you need to ask a lot of questions, but you need to ask them the right way. And that is, a lot of that is about tone. Okay, so what you want to make very clear that you're curious and you're interested in learning about the situation, and you want to understand. You want to understand whatever's going on, whatever the situation is, and that's why you're asking questions. When people pick up that vibe from you, when they pick up the vibe of, I'm just trying to understand, I'm curious about this, I'm interested and I want to know more. When they pick up that vibe, they're much more receptive than if they're picking up the vibe of, I don't like this, I'm suspicious, what's going on here? And that will all come by the nature of your questions. It's like, if you can begin your question by sort of expressing curiosity, say, hey, I'm curious about, let's say we're talking about a prenuptial, I'm curious about why this is important to you, what you're trying to achieve with it. And like both parties should be asking those kinds of questions. What is it that maybe makes you uncomfortable about it? Don't be afraid to ask someone what their issues might be, because that's what you want to find out, right? You want to find out what are the emotions at play here, what's under the surface, right? A lot of times that's another thing questioning is good for. It's good for kind of getting under the surface what people are saying initially. They're kind of surface statements, which may not be really the truth, or it may not be the full truth. And you want to kind of get under that. So sometimes you need to use questioning to say, hey, I heard you say, you don't really care about this situation or whatever, but, can we go a little deeper on that? How, what are you thinking about it? What, you must have some thoughts. Can you let me know, how you feel about it? So I think that's kind of where you're trying to go with questioning in almost any interpersonal situation. Corey, one of the go-to questions with any engagement is to try to get at what, and I like to use the word challenges, right? Or challenging, as opposed to problems. So you want to find out, what are the challenges of this situation for you? Like what would cause you to feel that this is difficult or a challenge, and how can we address that? So I think whenever I always tell managers, the most important thing they can ask the people they're working with or working for them, the most important thing they can find out is what does that person see as their challenges that they're facing in their daily work, right? And that could be both things that are getting in the way, as well as things on a positive note, things they really want to achieve, things they're really hoping for, the end goal that they're shooting for. So you want to find out, you always want to be asking about challenges. What within this situation, what are the challenges for you? What's creating issues for you? And then also, what is it that you're hoping to ultimately end up with? What to you represents a good solution or a good end goal? So with questioning, you're trying to get the person to articulate those things, the things that they're having a problem with, and the things that the ultimate solution they'd like to aim toward.
And this makes sense. I mean, it's not necessarily, you've heard this from some great therapists, not necessarily what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah.
And same with questioning. And I was thinking with the prenups, the challenge is the perception is this marriage traditional, where everything is acquired is going to be ours? Or is there some parts of our marital energy, of our marital estate, which we're going to keep separate? And I think having these questions early on, when you 100% are collaborative, I mean, I would say most people getting married are collaborative. Much better to have these questions early on before you're married, then you have surprises because people have different perceptions about things. So I think that's those two questions are wise. When people call me for prenups, I always say, let's talk. I'll give you some information about the law, explain marital property, marital property sharing, separate property is yours. And, everything else is really up to you guys, how you want to design your marriage. And having these conversations early on with these softer questions, it sounds like, opens up a great dialogue, which I think you should have anyway. And it's hard to talk about finances. It's easy to talk about finances maybe when you have a lot of finances, but if you have debt or things, you're supporting other children, maybe at a second marriage, things get complicated.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind for everyone with questioning. I talk a lot about why, right? The WHY. To me, it's the most important question, right? Why it's often the starting point for really important breakthroughs or really important conversations. Because why, when you're asking why, you're trying to understand something, right? So I think it's like whenever you're having a challenging conversation, under the surface of that is why. There's a lot of whys going on there, Like, why are we having this conversation in the first place? Why is it important to me? Why should we talk about this issue? Why might it make us uncomfortable? So there's a lot of those whys under the surface that you want to be addressing. But at the same time, I always warn people that why is also a dangerous word, because a lot of times if you ask people why in a very direct way, like, why did you do that? Or why are you doing this? Or why do you keep blah, blah, blah? Why do you keep saying that? It sounds almost like an attack, right? The art of using why is really important. So it's a word you have to use very gently, and you have to make it clear to the person that you're trying to figure out why, so that everybody has a clear understanding of what's going on, and nobody is holding anything back, and nobody is like being mad but not saying anything, or being resentful but not mentioning it. With why, you're trying to get everything on the table, right? But you have to do it in a way you're always sort of coaching and saying, hey, I'd like to understand why, maybe you might feel a certain way about an issue, and I want you to understand this is not about judgment. It's not about anything. It's just about me trying to understand, and you sharing what you feel, and then maybe we can figure some stuff out. So you always have to be kind of, as you're using why, you have to use it in a really thoughtful and gentle way. It's like you're just gently leading someone along, and not, instead of interrogating. You never want to be in the position of seeming like you're an interrogator, and you never want to be using questioning in a way that makes it sound like you're judging, right? Like,
so easy to do, though. So easy to do.
The biggest judging question is like, why would you do something like that? Or, what were you thinking? Or what, so a lot of us use questions as a form of criticism. So you really have to look out for that, because that's just once you start doing that, you're not really asking questions, right? That's like taking a statement or an opinion and dressing it up as a question. So to me, those are like counterfeit questions. They're not real. The way you're asking a real question is very simple. You're curious about the answer. As long as you're curious and interested in the answer, then it's a legitimate, valid question. As soon as the question becomes a tactic or an attack tool, a criticism, as soon as it becomes any of those things, now you're no longer asking, in my view, legitimate questions.
Yeah, when you're saying this, it makes me think about when I get triggered, in these conversations I have with my partner or in my life, a lot of times I just have to say nothing because it's not going to come out curious. So I think a big part of this is putting yourself in the right frame of mind.
Yeah.
And that leads me to my next question I have for you, which changing the topic a little bit. How about asking questions to yourself? Because you said those tech guys did that to think about really wonderful products. But one topic I want to think about is getting divorced. We talked about prenups, starting the marriage, getting
Right.
divorced. I assume these questions start with you before you tell your partner that you want a divorce. And I think a lot of us, maybe just me, when we ask ourselves questions, we're also very rough with ourselves. We ask ourselves challenging questions that are not coming from that space of curiosity. It's almost like you're asking yourself judgment questions. So, so how can we ask ourselves better questions, if we're thinking about the topic of getting divorced? Like, maybe this marriage is not really working for us anymore. We want to get divorced. What questions do you think we can ask ourselves, and just going through an anatomy of how we could break that down so we can ask ourselves better questions?
There's a couple of things to keep in mind in terms of asking yourself questions, okay? It's something that we tend to avoid. So and the reason, so I'm a questionologist, right? So I always say, okay, why, right? So if we tend to avoid asking ourselves, kind of difficult questions, why, right? Why do we do that? Well, I think that the main reason we do it is out of fear, and the fear is that you don't have an answer. So we're really, as human beings, we are really afraid of bumping up against something and then not knowing what to do, or being in a situation where we're lost, or we don't know what comes next. So I think we have a deep-seated fear of asking ourselves questions and then saying, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And in fact, we have to get over that because that's not good. Like any of these innovators that I profile in my book, when they started out asking these big questions, they did not know the answer. They did not know. And the same is true with scientists. The same is true with philosophers. The same is true with anybody who is trying to solve a problem or change a situation. Usually at the beginning, they don't know the answer, right? But you have to start with the question. Like if you don't ask the question, then you'll never make progress on it. You'll never get started. You'll never start that journey of figuring stuff out, right? If you don't start with asking the question. So I think for all of us, we have to sort of talk to ourselves and say, look, I'm going to think about some of these issues. I'm going to think about some of these questions. I'm going to ask myself some questions, and I'm going to give myself permission to not have the answer right away. Because what I'm trying to do is get myself to think about it. I'm trying to get myself to explore it. Maybe in the process, I'll talk to other people and see what they think. And maybe I'll do some research. Maybe I'll read up on it. Or I'll just let it marinate in my brain. And what can happen when you do that with questions is, really amazing stuff. You will start to get insights. You'll start to see things differently. But you have to have the question there in your brain marinating. So I think when you're in a challenging situation, you start with, try to formulate some questions around, okay, why do I think this situation's not working as well as it might be? What's my vision of what the relationship should be, and how realistic is that? Or how attainable is that? Is there room for change here? Is there possibility for change? If there is possibility for change, where might it begin? What might be the first steps? So there's all kinds of questions you can ask yourself. And, you may have, you may come up with 10 questions, right? And you should, write those down or take note of them and then sort of think about them. But as I say, don't expect to maybe have all the answers right away. Just, it's a process of thinking about these questions. A simple sort of trick that I'll share with you. There's a really basic framework I like to use when taking on any kind of a problem, and that is to go through a cycle where you ask, first you ask why, then you ask what if, and then you ask how. So let's take the case of a marriage where people are arguing all the time, right? So you would start with why. You would start with, okay, why do we seem to be arguing all the time? And then maybe you would write down some of the situations that seem to trigger, some of the things that seem to trigger arguments. You'd make note of them. Okay, all right. So after you've kind of thought about the why, and you've sort of written some things down, then you'd ask, okay, what if we could change some of these problems? What if we could address some of these issues? So let's say there's there's constant arguments over a certain person in the family or something like that. You would try to construct a question around what if we could change our the way we deal with this person in a way that doesn't create so much tension between us. So you then pose that as a what if question, right? And then after you go through the what if stage of trying to sort of pose these questions about possibilities, then you might zero in on a couple and say, okay, let's see, if we were actually going to try this, how would we do it? So I posed a question, what if we could, change the way we talk about money? Okay, how might we put that into practice? Like what could be the first thing we do, starting next week? So what you do when you do that, when you ask why, what if, and how, you're just trying to lead yourself on a path from thinking about and understanding the problem to gradually coming up with steps you could take. Okay, it's like a circular path. And so I just advise everyone when they're dealing with these big challenges and as you're asking yourself questions, keep that little framework in mind, that why, what if, how. That can be helpful. But you can also ask all kinds of questions. They don't have to be part of that cycle or why, what if, how. There could be all kinds of questions that might be relevant to your relationship, your situation. You're trying to get at, what is it? What's going on here? What are the underlying issues? What are some things we could do? What are some possibilities? Is it worth saving? All of those kinds of things are questions you need to put on the table. And then, as I say, you need to work on those questions.
When I started improving my communication, I started off, I'm not sure if you're familiar with nonviolent communication with Marshall Rosenberg, one of my favorite books, I think, that explains communication. His third part of the process is questioning. And you seem to focus on that third part. What is challenging in these difficult conversations, even if it's to yourself, is to have that, I guess, state of mind to be open. So we're not in that fight or flight or shut down, because you could even be shut down with yourself. And I think these techniques you're using are so much better than, judgments and attacks and what we do normally to quote unquote persuade, which doesn't really persuade anyone. This gets everyone upset and maybe brings them to a bad place. So I think opening up that thought of, why do I want to get divorced, and thinking about that through that framework, I think it's helpful. And what I tell people, you might not just be happy.
Right.
There's I don't know if you saw those studies of people who win the lottery. A lot of people who win the lottery are not happy later on. Right. And I think we all have a baseline. For example, I was in court once, and the officer, he says, what the problem is with everyone here? I've been married 30 years. And he goes, give us the sage advice about marriage. He goes, expectations. I was like, well, that's fair. That's fair. So, are my expectations realistic?
Right.
And all these big questions that you can start off with yourself. I think that's good.
The reason you're trying to really dig deep with whys, there's a technique called the 5 whys. Are you familiar with that? The 5 whys?
Yeah. Is that Drucker?
Actually, it started in Japan with the Toyota company, and they were using a system of asking why 5 times whenever there was a problem. So if a part came off the assembly line and it was defective, they were trained to ask, okay, why is the part defective? And the first answer might be, well, the guy on the assembly line screwed up, and now normally you might stop there and just, fire the poor guy on the assembly line and think you solved the problem. But they felt, no, you then keep asking, okay, why did that guy on the assembly line screw up? And then you might find out, okay, he didn't get the enough training. Okay, why didn't he get enough training? Well, he didn't get enough training because we cut back on the training program last year, and so on. And so they felt that if you asked why in a cycle like that repeatedly, you would get beneath the surface and you would get to the real issue, the real core issue. So I think that applies well to something like a marriage that's having problems, right? You not only need to ask why, you need to ask why again deeper. You need to go deeper with your whys, because the first why might be, well, we're arguing all the time, right? Okay, but why are you arguing all the time? And so you kind of have to go deeper and deeper to get at those core issues. And I think what your reason for doing this is ultimately what in the case of deciding on divorce, you're ultimately trying to figure out. You're trying to understand what the challenges are so you can see if they're solvable or not, right? Because maybe they're solvable and maybe they're not, and maybe they're so basic or they're so fundamental that they would require the other person to completely change their personality, and that's probably not going to happen, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to unearth the real reasons, the real core problems, the deepest problems, so that you can lay them on the table for yourself and maybe eventually for the other person if you end up in that kind of a conversation. But you can put those problems on the table and then ask yourself, are these problems something that could be worked on? Are they potentially solvable? Or are they just, such deep problems that really the chances are we're not going to ever fix them, So I think that's kind of that's why you're doing why. That's the why behind the why.
Right. Well, the why I'm thinking when people think about divorce, a lot of times people say, well, I want to get divorced, but the children are still, in school. Should I wait?
Right.
So why should I wait? And then the research is, well, if you're in a household that's toxic, that's not necessarily helpful for the kids anyway. Yeah. So why would I want to wait if I'm in a bad marriage? But what can I do? I know it's not a why question. What can I do to improve that? If the only thing you can do is what you're saying is to move on, that's one idea. The other thing might take a lot of work, which is changing your personality, your patterns, and that can take time, as we all know.
If you're asking about, how might this potentially affect the kids, that's a question that you're going to have to really think long and hard on, maybe talk to some people about it, maybe do some research. You mentioned research has been done on this, and you really need to look deeply at that issue because there's no easy answer to it. It's not like, oh yeah, people should always stay together for the kids. That's not true, right? So you need to figure out, again, in this situation, what are the pros and cons? What is really going to be best for them as opposed to just what I automatically assume might be best. And that's another example of the kind of question that you're going to have to articulate it, put it on the table, and then work on it. Like I say, a lot of times questioning is about thinking about something for a while, but it's also about talking to people. It's about doing your research, doing your homework, so that you can eventually answer this question in a halfway intelligent way. And a lot of these questions, by the way, it's not like there's a right answer for some of these questions, one definitive right answer. But what you're trying to do is come up with the best answer you can come up with. You're trying to come up with the best answer, the one that is the most thoughtful, the one that has considered different perspectives, the one that makes the most sense, the one that is based in some knowledge as opposed to just random, gut instinct or gut reactions. You're trying to go for like a more sensible answer as opposed to a off the cuff answer, an emotional answer, which is what we usually do as human beings. We just kind of fly off the handle and we come up with an answer right away. And because we don't want to deal with it, we don't want to deal with the issue. So we just say, this is what I feel. This is my instinct. I'm going with it. That's what we want to avoid a lot, because those kinds of gut reactions can really get us into trouble. A lot of times they're based in emotion. They're based too much in emotion. And a lot of times we think we know more than we do. We haven't thought about the issue. We haven't done any homework. We haven't talked to people. And so, you've got to be careful about, going too much with emotion and gut instinct. And that's part of what questioning is trying to get you to do. What self-questioning is trying to get you to say, hey, I'm not just going to go with my gut. I'm not just going to go with my instinct. I'm going to think about this stuff. I'm going to consider some other viewpoints aside from my initial gut feeling, and I'm going to try to bring all that together so I can make a good decision.
You're reminding me in your book, I learned a new term, many terms, but one term in particular is this idea of a question storming. I've heard of brainstorming before. I never heard of question storming. And the idea right there, instead of coming up, if you're brainstorming, quote unquote, divorce, maybe have a question storm. Of all these questions, and that frees you, as you said, because you might not know the right answer. They might be these are difficult decisions, and either path might have pros and cons, and the differences might be marginal.
Yeah, the idea of question storming is interesting. It's just the basis of it is that when we ask a lot of questions about a topic, and the topic could be, it could be divorce, or it could be, in business, everybody's trying to get loyal customers, right? So it could be, the topic could be customer loyalty or something. And the idea is you just put a topic down, you write it down, and you just try to come up with as many questions as you can possibly think of about this topic. And when you do that, it has an interesting effect. It causes you to look at the topic from a lot of different angles and try to think about it in different ways so that you can formulate all these questions about it. And as you do that, a lot of times it causes you to see things a little differently. It can help you come up with ideas you might not have come up with otherwise. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I recommend, when you're dealing with an issue or a challenge, the more questions, the better. If you can write down 50 questions, that come to mind about this challenge, go ahead and do it. Write them all down, and then maybe try to figure out, well, okay, there's 50 questions I've written down. I can't deal with all 50 of them. That's too many. But maybe I can look through this list and figure out what are the 5 or the 3 questions that really seem important or that really resonate with me. They kind of seem to get at the heart of the issue. And so maybe then you pull out those core questions, and those are the ones you can spend time with and maybe think about more.
With getting divorced, the one question or the framework, which is such a smart way of looking at things, is begin with the end in mind.
Oh, yeah.
And we're so focused on now, the next few years. But the one thing that I see the advantage of having a marriage could be a lifelong relationship. And it's so hard to decide how are you going to feel decades in the future.
Yeah, it is.
And I think you're probably going to be a different person. So you're
Right.
probably, I think probably in a long-term marriage, you're marrying a different person every few decades, when they're dating, when they're
Yeah.
maybe single in New York City, maybe when you have children, you want to move out of the city, maybe when
Yeah.
you're older, you want to travel, maybe you don't want to travel. Well, maybe you get really into pickleball and everyone's into
Right.
pickleball now. I hate pickleball. I want to swim. So all these things change.
Right.
And
Right.
it's just going to be such variety over the years.
Yeah.
All right. Listen, in your latest book, in The Beautiful Questions in the Classroom, you came up with an acronym, BBQ. I was hoping you were talking about barbecue because I love ribs, but you're not talking about barbecue. You're talking about big, beautiful questions. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on what is a big, beautiful question. And before you answer that, well, I have a statement. I don't have a question yet, but my statement is getting divorced without losing your mind. And could that be turned into a big, beautiful question?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you can create a question just by putting. This is like an easy trick, right? Just take 3 words and put it on the beginning of that statement or that title, and the 3 words are either "How might we?" or "How might I?" depending on whether you're thinking about it in terms of yourself or whether you're thinking about it in terms of somebody else, you and somebody else, a collaborative thing. So, how might I get through a divorce without losing my mind is a beautiful question. On the other hand, before you get to that point of the divorce, maybe a how might we question is worth pursuing. That might be a beautiful question worth pursuing. How might we, as a couple, find a way to, appreciate our differences more? And, you can sort of construct the question based on what it is you're trying to do, or it could be based on the challenges you see in your relationship. If you see that, boy, we love to laugh together, but we also have these diverging interests, so then the beautiful question you ask with the other person might be, how might we, find a way to live with our diverging interests, work with that, and at the same time, find ways to laugh more together. And you could even add on another part to it. These beautiful questions could have 3 parts or 4 parts to them. How might we do this while at the same time making sure we do that? And also, let's be sure we do more of this. And so all of that becomes one big, beautiful, how might we question. And so basically what I'm advising them to do is to take all their dreams and their problems, or maybe just one big dream and problem, and try to put them into the form of a question. And again, the starter of how might I or how might we is a pretty good tool. Doesn't mean the question has to start with that. You could have your own version of a beautiful question that is different. But I do find if you're looking for an easy way to frame these types of questions, that can be a good starting word. How might I or how might we? And then the rest of it is up to you. How you build the rest of the question is a matter of putting the pieces together of what you're trying to do, or what the goal is, or what the dream is, and you try to put it all into one big, beautiful question. Now, why are you doing that, right? Questionologists, I always ask why. So why should you put your goals or your dreams or your challenges in the form of a question? Why not just write them down and say, I will do this, or I will do a better job of, I want to start drinking more water, okay? There's 2 ways I could go here. I could put it as a resolution or a statement. I could say, starting today, I will drink more water. Or I could put it as a beautiful question. The beautiful question would be, how might I get myself to drink more water? Okay, what's the difference between those 2 things? Well, there's been studies done on this that have found that when we give ourselves an order we tend to ignore it. It's like New Year's resolutions. That's what a New Year's resolution is. It's an order that you give yourself, right? They don't seem to work that well. We tend to, we start out with good intentions and then we kind of put it aside. What the research has found is we have a different reaction to questions than we do to statements. So if you ask yourself a question, it's almost like it triggers something in your brain. It triggers your brain the way a puzzle does, the way you almost can't help trying to put the pieces together and figure it out. So a question will challenges yourself, it challenges your brain to try to come up with solutions and ideas. So if I ask that question, how might I get myself to drink more water? I immediately might come up with an idea and say, well, I could leave some water by the, in these various places throughout the house. So I'm reminded. So I might come up with an idea right away, but that's not like where it ends, because once you sort of put that question in your brain, what you're going to find is, the next day you'll be taking a shower and all of a sudden you'll say, oh, wow, I have another idea. I could do this. And then maybe you'll share the question with someone. You'll say, yeah, I'm working on this question of how might I get myself to drink more water? And the person will say, oh, you know what you ought to try? You ought to try this. So there's something about a question that is much more dynamic, and it sort of sets things in motion, and it leads to more ideas, and then the ideas tend to lead to more action or results. So I always recommend that people try to take their whatever it is they're trying to achieve and articulate it as a question, and write that question down, put it on the bulletin board, share the question with people, because they'll help you. They'll say, oh, I know something about that. Questions are very shareable, unlike statements. Statements are not so shareable. If I say, I'm going to drink more water, well, nobody, I tell someone that, they don't want to hear that. Who cares? That's you. But if I say, hey, I'm working on this question, all of a sudden they have a chance to get involved. Like they say, oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, here's my thoughts on that. So
it doesn't make you defensive to questions.
Right, exactly. And so, it's just, it's very inviting. It's very kind of empowering. I think I may have mentioned this to you before, Corey, but I go into companies and I say to them, you should take your mission statement, your company mission statement, and change it into a mission question. So whatever your statement is, like we are, the example I give sometimes is, let's say it's a robotics company, and their statement is, we make the world a better place through robotics, right? I'm saying to them, you should change that to, how might we make the world a better place through robotics? Because it's just a more empowering kind of, it's more empowering, it's more exciting, it's more interesting. The statement, nobody knows what to do with that statement, right? It's like it just kind of lays there it's like a slogan, just like what are you going to do with it, right? But a question, once you put it into question form, all of a sudden people can say, oh, I have ideas on that, and you get people engaged and you get them thinking. So, so that's just my general philosophy. Whenever you can take a big goal you have or a challenge and turn it into a question, it's a good thing to do.
Before I let you go, I appreciate your time. I want to see if you can reframe some questions. You've been talking about how we should ask questions, we shouldn't ask statements. So I have created a couple of questions.
Okay.
Common divorce topics.
Yeah.
I want to see if you can, since you're the questionologist, improve it. So here's first on custody. The topic is custody.
Mm-hmm.
How can I create a parenting plan, or how can we create a parenting plan where one of us does not put our child first?
I'm not sure I understand why one of us, why you're singling out one of us. Because automatically that starts to make it seem, like there's an accusation buried within that question somewhere. So I would I would probably simplify the question. First of all, I like the word might over can. So anytime you have a how can we or how should we question, I advise always take out the can or should and replace it with might. Might is a much more open word. It's more open language, and people respond better to it. It's a kind of language that's used in creative sessions and in brainstorming because it kind of opens up the conversation. So I'd start with how might we, but then I would frame the question around. Tell me what is it you're trying to get at with this question? You're trying to say, what is this question trying to address?
Is trying to come up with a parenting plan
Right.
where one parent feels the other parent does not put the children first.
So I would sort of shift that to a more positive framework and say, how might we come up with a parenting plan where everyone can feel that the children are getting the best from both of us? How might we come up with a plan, that enables us to feel and be comfortable that children are getting the best of both of us, And within that question, I think you may come up with sub-questions, and the sub-questions may involve, how can we avoid a situation where, where it seems like one of us is getting priority over the other, or one of us is how can we always make sure that the kids are front and center in every discussion that we do? So you could have those be kind of offshoot questions that come under the bigger one. But when you're framing a beautiful question, try to keep it very positive. So
Yeah.
I would say in your initial question, don't focus on the negative, and the negative would be one of us doing this more than the other, or whatever. That's negative, right? So instead, try to frame that as a positive, where both of us are able to, have the most effective and productive relationship with our kids, and frame it around the positive goal that you're trying to achieve.
Love that, Warren. Love that. Okay, try this one. This is child support. I'm going to try to use some of the techniques you just told me. So here's my take on a child support question that comes up often. This is more of in a collaborative state where you can be a little bit more creative. Question is, what if instead of paying child support, we shared a joint account and agreed to contribute to this joint account according to our means for our child's expenses?
That's great. That question is perfectly fine as is. I don't think you need to change it, because what if questions, that's a great what if question. Remember, what if questions are just possibilities, right? So they don't have to be, they're not concrete things you're putting out there. There's something you're putting out on the table so that it can be discussed and explored. And I think that one's fine as it is. The only thing is now with those types of questions, always good to do a little preamble or something, where you say to the other, you make sure the other person understands the spirit in which this question is being put out there. So you want to say something like, I want to explore all kinds of possibilities here. There's no reason we have to do the traditional route. We should be open to everything, and everything should be open to discussion. I'm going to throw a couple of possibilities out there. I'd love it if you have a couple of ideas too. And here's one that comes to mind right away. What if we did this? Okay. So by doing that little preamble, you just prepare the person for the idea that this is just an idea. You don't want them to get defensive right away and to think, oh, he's trying to force this on me. If this is what he wants to do, and you don't want them to be thinking, what is he trying to get away with here? What is he trying to pull? So you need to address that in advance, and then you also need to address it, in in the discussion, just make sure if you have a possibility like that you're putting on the table, just make sure that you are, openly discussing, what are the advantages of this and what are the disadvantages, both for me and for you, for both of us. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Try to get everything on the table, because otherwise it's going to be a problem later on. If you convince someone to go along with that plan, if they really underneath are not that comfortable with it, or they have some issues, it's probably going to come up later. They're going to have a problem with it later, right? So later on and then it'll just be ugly, right? They'll say, you came up with that stupid plan. So you have to get buy-in from them at the time, real true buy-in. And that through questioning, you need to dig and make sure that this idea you have really works for them too, and that they're really comfortable with it, right? That they really are, they understand it. They understand the rationale behind it. They understand why it seems to make sense. We also are going to talk about where it could be a problem. We're going to talk about pros and cons versus the more traditional thing we might do. We're going to look at the two options side by side. So if you really want this idea to take hold, you have to do some work, so you have to present it the right way. And then you have to be willing with the other person to take it apart, to dissect it and from every angle and say, okay, does it work? Does it work? Does it work for you? Does it work for me? How do we envision this unfolding? What are the pros and cons? And then at the end of a conversation like that, you might actually have full buy-in by both people. And then you're okay. Then you're good to go.
I love that, stating the intention, because generally at that point in a divorce, people have negative perspectives. Obviously,
Right.
in the start of the relationship, there's such positive perspectives. So it's great because the negative perspective is you're cheating me out of child support. So it's very good that you address that in a concrete way, and also being open to other ideas. Listen, thank you, Warren, for joining us on this conversation about divorce. Is there any last thought, or because of you, question you would like to leave us, especially for our listeners who are trying to get divorced in a more creative, and I know it's hard, and less reactive way?
Okay, it's not a question, but the last thing we discussed brought up one final idea, and that is, I've been talking about this thing called the question sandwich, right? And so a question sandwich is when you take the question and you put something in front of it and you put something after it. So you're like sandwiching it. And so the thing you put in front of it is curiosity, and the thing you put after it is rationale. So on the example we just gave, the question is, what if we tried this alternative plan? Okay, so the way you would present that as a question sandwich is you start with curiosity. And that means simply saying, I've been thinking about something. I've been wondering about something. I'm curious about something. And then you put the question in, what if we tried X, Y, and Z? And then you end with rationale. And the rationale is, the reason I bring this up, or the reason I'm asking this question, is because of blah, blah, blah. You can do that with almost any challenging question. Start with curiosity, then ask the question, then put the rationale on the end of it. Here's why I'm asking you that. It just takes away a lot of the problems, a lot of the defensiveness that often goes with this type of question.
Warren, that is fantastic. So smart. Also, I love your examples. You have barbecue. So you must be a foodie, and sandwich. I remember these things. So you're a great teacher. Thank you for all the work you have done in this field. And I think you're going to be doing more, hopefully, in the divorce field. I know you've been in the business field. I know you spent, I think, earlier on in the design field. So maybe your next book or two is going to be about designing a better divorce.
Yeah, hopefully I won't be writing about my own marriage. But yeah, it's a great field for questioning. It's ripe for more questioning thoughts and ideas.
Thank you again, Warren.
All right. Thanks, Corey.